Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 9. We are moving on from the Industrial Revolution and going to talk about a new Europe that is emerging in the 19th century. There are some very powerful forces at play in the 19th century. There's a lot of unfulfilled potential. There's a lot of misery, there's a lot of violence, and there's the potential for cataclysmic confrontation on the horizon. We're going to split this lecture into two separate kind of lectures. We're going to look at two phases. The first, we're going to look basically, broadly speaking, at nationalism and how nationalism can lead to certain attitudes, ideas about in-groups and out-groups about what a nation stands for and what a nation is willing to do to defend itself and the rhetoric behind that. So we're also going to talk about things like patriotism and jingoism, which are flip sides of kind of the same coin. We're then going to move on to social movements. Social movements are both a product of and caused by a reaction to the changes in reality that we talked about last week when we talked about the Industrial Revolution in England, about the percentage of people who are moving to the cities, about the populations growing. Eventually, something has to give, and sometimes there's a level of radicalism that comes along with that when the powers that be will not listen to or are willfully ignorant of the needs of the masses. So that's the 19th century in broad spectrum or broad brush strokes. Let's get into it. First off, when we're talking about nationalism, we're going to look at three phrases that are increasingly important throughout the 19th century. The first is a balance of powers. This is important because it is an agreement, kind of tacit and also stated outright, that European nations would essentially be equal rivals to each other so that security could be maintained and national sovereignty could be maintained by being as powerful as your rivals. The problem with that is the idea of being as powerful. Nobody ever wants to be equal to their rival. They want to always kind of one up their rival. That is just true. It's human nature. And that is unfortunately true in the rivalry of nations. It's not enough to be, okay, we have exactly the same size army, we have exactly the same size navy, we have exactly the same kind of technology. It is never enough. Eventually, somebody's going to say, well, we should really have a little bit of an edge so we can maybe take on multiple antagonists, or we can maybe project a little bit and show our dominance over our neighbors. It's never enough to be equal. You want to be somewhat more powerful. So this leads to a increasing spiral of larger armies, more sophisticated armies, and increasing political tension. Hand in hand with that balance of power and that idea of protecting national sovereignty is this concept of nationalism. And we'll get a little bit more into nationalism, but in a nutshell, nationalism is a kind of indoctrination into people that educates them in a way that they see themselves as part of a larger whole, and not so much a part of a larger whole vis-a-vis like part of a city or part of a tribe or part of a family, but something a little more amorphous as being a part of a country or a republic or a democracy or whatever. These are very amorphous terms that can not be easily defined, cannot be, you can't necessarily point to and say, these people are part of my democracy, but those people aren't, the way you could, let's say, a religious affiliation or a blood affiliation or an ethnic affiliation. So it transcends that. And that's a good thing in one aspect, but it can be abused and misused later on down. Now, along with that balance of power and along with that identity of nationalism, we also have détente. Détente is a French term that's actually used in the early 20th century to describe the relationship between Germany and France, where they kind of weren't enemies per se anymore, but they really weren't very friendly. Um, so somewhere between being friends and being hated enemies. So maybe pretty close to frenemy, though less enemy or less friend and more enemy. But even though it's used in the early 20th century, it can be adequately used to describe the relationship amongst European powers throughout the 19th century. That although they will work with each other on certain issues, they are, at the end of the day, rivals, not friends. For example, France and Russia, rivals, not friends, but they will work together to counter Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary and France, not exactly friends, but they will work together to counter Russia, and so on. So why do I pick up at 1815? Well, as I mentioned with the Atlantic revolutions, there was a revolution in France that brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power. And although we didn't talk about Napoleon's conquests of Europe, because that's more of a military history, gets into nuts and bolts and nitty gritty, essentially Napoleon represented a potentially destructive or frightening threat to the powers that be in a lot of different European countries, particularly in Great Britain and Russia, because he had relatively easily toppled the old powers of Spain and Austria. He had easily countered the Prussian military might, which was considered the apex of its time, and he seemed to be on the verge of conquering all of Europe and instituting a kind of pan-European, Frankish, French authority over the entire continent. Well, Napoleon Bonaparte is finally defeated in 1815, and that cooperation, which had been necessary to defeat him, it took multiple nations, multiple fronts, and also a very bad tactical blunder on the part of Napoleon of marching into Russia on the cusp of a winter with really stretched thin supply lines. There's a couple of things that play into his defense, but or into his defeat. But in general, the European powers had to band together in order to defeat Napoleon. Napoleon was defeated, but that cooperation didn't last. Remember, we're talking about rivalries here. We will work together for a common enemy, and instead it dissolves into this kind of sense of détente. We're not actively antagonistic towards each other, but we're not terribly helpful towards each other. Still, that rivalry exists. The victorious nations redraw political boundaries and reshape Europe into a recognizably modern European state. So a lot of the excuse me, a lot of the countries, the smaller countries that had been present in the Balkans, become consolidated. A lot of the principalities in the Germanic states, they still exist for a little while, for the next about 30 years before they become consolidated. Poland gets redrawn. The French boundaries get redrawn, and so on. And it doesn't take into account the needs or desires or history of ethnic, religious, linguistic groups of people. These are literally lines drawn on a map and agreed to in a smoke-filled boardroom. National policies are then, well, during the Napoleonic Wars, something unexpected occurs. Instead of just defending the king or defending the crown, you begin to see the emergence of language about defending the land itself. And we get to see the emergence of nationalism, particularly in the military. And from the military, it begins to percolate out into the wider civilian audience. And you get to see the kind of beginnings of this nationalist um, rhetoric that filters out in order to educate the populace about what they are a part of. Some of this is due to revolutionary ideas, such as in the United States. This idea of nationalism had really emerged almost from the very beginning, this kind of concept of indoctrinating people into uh, believing they are part of something greater than just their local government or their state government, but rather they're part of a federal government. That really hadn't translated very well across the Atlantic, but now that the Napoleonic Wars are over, they begin to borrow bits and pieces from that program, if you will, that kind of unofficial ad hoc program in the United States, and they begin to educate their citizens, let's say, of becoming what it means to be Austro-Hungarian, or what it means to be Spanish, or what it means to be English, or the United part of Britain, as it were, as the empires begin to absorb different ethnicities, different linguistic roots, and different peoples, even across large boundaries. So Napoleon was an existential threat to the powers that be, and the powers that be are vested in maintaining the status quo. That is absolutely true throughout time. There is no power structure that is willing to give up any amount of power, especially to somebody who seems to be born of revolutionary notions. This concept that anybody can rise to through the ranks of power and command a nation. This is a potential inspiration to the lower classes. So Napoleon represents not just a military threat, but a potential home front threat. That what if our social fabric, which is very strong but brittle. What if it gets shattered and we have our own Napoleon, say, in Russia, or we have our own Napoleon, say, in England? We've got to make sure that this doesn't happen. Show that the lower class can, for a short period of time, have power, but eventually they will be struck down as if it were God's will. A united, conquered Europe also necessarily loses its sovereignty. So, much like we see with the rhetoric surrounding the Brexit now, this concept of national sovereignty, of being able to chart your own course based upon your national needs, is something that is very primal in a majority of people. This idea that someone somewhere at a far distant capital who maybe doesn't even speak your own language can dictate a policy to you is causes European nations to chafe. Now, the irony is not lost on me, by the way, that at the same time that Europeans are worried about some foreigner coming in imposing rules upon them against their will, they were more than happy to go abroad and establish colonies and impose their will on other people, even if they didn't speak the local language. So there is a little bit of irony there. Uh, along hand in hand with that loss of sovereignty is a loss of perhaps cultural identity as laws become uniform, as language becomes uniform, as traditions become uniform, as things are upended, as tradition goes out the window. Now, the status quo is quite invested in maintaining and perpetuating its own power. So these are very uh, serious threats to the monarchies of Europe, to England or Great Britain in particular, to Russia in particular, to the Scandinavian nations in particular. And so there's this coalition that really arises to kind of defeat Napoleon. And once he's defeated, initially he's sent into exile. He comes back for a short period of time, kind of like Revenge of the Empire Strikes Back kind of thing. But he gets defeated relatively quickly because they're very keen to make sure he doesn't get the initiative again. and keep him on his back foot. Eventually, Napoleon dies in exile, and the the powers that be begin to exert a kind of anti-revolutionary um, anti-revolutionary program. Now, this anti-revolutionary program begins with nationalism. Now, nationalism had really been used in the military to kind of inspire people. The Napoleon had this famous saying, and I'm gonna paraphrase here. You cannot inspire, you cannot raise a large enough army based on 2 pennies a day to fight for your nation. You must inspire a man. You must speak to his soul. And that's what nationalism is. Nationalism is speaking to the soul of the person, telling them that glory awaits them, that they are an integral part of this movement to defend everything that they are familiar with, everything that they grew up with. And nationalism is used as a kind of version of continuing education for the people. The war versus Napoleon initially started off as safeguarding the nation state, making sure it stayed integral. And then nationalism kind of evolved in the wider sense to see the value in the nation state, that being British meant something. And a key to nationalism is defining who we are. Who is the in group? Who do we identify with? What do we stand for? What ideals do we stand for? What makes us unique versus other countries? Because other countries have, for instance, pants, right? Everybody has pants, so it can't be like, oh, we're the only ones that have pants. It has to be something a little bit more, something amorphous, preferably. You can't say, oh, all of us are, 6'2", and anybody shorter than that is not part of our nation state. A little too specific, a little too concrete. You have to have this kind of ideal that's very intangible and hard to pin down. Now, there can be healthy nationalism, and there is indeed very healthy nationalism. It happens every time there is some kind of national disaster in the United States. When there's a tornado or a flood or massive wildfires, we all donate to charities, we send money, we worry about people that we've never met. So it inspires a healthy nationalism, inspires camaraderie amongst people, even if you have no chance of ever meeting them. If you ever travel abroad, if you're ever part of a study abroad, or if you're ever like backpacking through countries, whether it's Southeast Asia or Europe or Africa or Latin America or whatever, occasionally you may come across somebody who speaks your language. Maybe they're from Texas or they're from Alaska or California or whatever. Doesn't matter. Somehow you have that instant bond with them, the way that you probably wouldn't have in as you're visiting that foreign country. Well, that is nationalism. That's a healthy version of nationalism. You're inspired to be loyal to this abstract idea of what it means to be an American. You also are motivated to defend things like freedom. What does freedom mean? Well, can you point to exactly what does freedom mean? Is freedom just basically anarchy where everybody can do whatever they want within the confines of their ability? Or is it maybe the freedom to not worry that other people are going to come in and take your property because there are no laws? So maybe it's not anarchy, maybe it's a level of order. You know how I mean? It's very difficult to define precisely what freedom means. And it also inspires self-sacrifice. Just like we talked about with the floods or the fires, you taking money out of your bank account or you taking time to volunteer to help people who were wrecked by a tornado, or you taking time to phone bank for a preferred candidate, or anything. That is self-sacrifice. You're giving of yourself for the greater good with no hope of reward. you're not expecting something in return, like they're going to give you free cookies or something like that. You're doing it out of an inspiration. You feel it is incumbent upon you. That is healthy nationalism. Now, there can be unhealthy nationalism as well, so it can go overboard. Unhealthy nationalism can be used to alienate or dehumanize people who are not part of your nation state. So, people from other countries, people who have maybe different ethnic backgrounds or different linguistic or different racial backgrounds or different religious backgrounds. It can also be used to create enemies within the nation state. That there can be a group of people who can be declared as enemies of the people, and that this group within our country is a cancer and needs to be excised, and they're doing nothing but poisoning us. They're inferior, and this leads to things like racial discrimination, like the Jim Crow laws, that somehow black people are inferior and they must be held to even more stringent laws, and they're not allowed to do things like hold office or be educated in the same building as white people. We have to keep them separated. We have to keep them down because that keeps America free somehow. Right, so that's an unhealthy nationality. And so unhealthy nationalism leads to cruelty, bigotry, ignorance, and mindless mob violence that is just reprehensible, historically speaking. So I have a question for you. Are you, the student, indoctrinated by nationalism? And a lot of you be like, "Oh no, I'm not indoctrinated. I don't believe in indoctrination. I'm independent. I think for myself." But I want you to finish this statement. I pledge allegiance. You knew the next line, didn't you? What about how about land of the free, home of the. You knew that. You knew. Instead, it came up, bang, super fast. What about this one? How about this one? This is a good one. How about thank you for your. Right. Are you sure you're not indoctrinated? It's a good question, isn't it? What does it mean to be indoctrinated? Well, it means that you know some of these axioms by heart, almost as if somebody throughout your entire life, or several somebody throughout your entire life, kept reinforcing these messages. So yes, we are all indoctrinated by nationalism. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does leave the door open to some abuses and misuses. There can be multiple subtle and sometimes not so subtle influences. Thomas Jefferson, for example, recognized the need to educate the masses in Republican virtues. And so there's a lot of symbology that's invested from the very beginning of the United States in evoking this concept of Romanesque value and Romanesque adherence to a republic form of government without teaching people what does it mean to be part of a republic. And this happens with money. If you look at the dollar bill, for example, it is loaded with imagery. There's patriotic imagery with a portrait of a president on the front, with Latin on the back, with symbols of eagles holding 13 olive branches and 13 arrows. And 13 is a very mystical, magical number for Americans, isn't it? It's a number of original colonies that eventually broke away from Great Britain. And why the olive branch? Well, the olive branch for peace. 13 colonies living in peace. Why the arrows? 13 colonies ready for war to defend the United States of America. And you even have these Latin phrases and this kind of very mystical kind of Freemason iconography, like the pyramid with the all-seeing eye, as if the nation itself was awake and watching us and our behavior and judging us. Are we being good Americans? It's also present in architecture and art. On the bottom here, we have a picture of the Forum from Rome. And then on the top, we have a picture of the Supreme Court. They're almost identical. Well, Thomas Jefferson had a hand in designing a lot of the monuments that would later be built in Washington, D.C. And these are very evocative of the kind of neoclassical architectural style that evokes this kind of almost golden age, if you will, of European past, when there was republics, when there were democratic institutions, when people worked for civic virtue. They did things for the country, for the good of the people, out of the goodness of their heart and out of inspiration to support. They paid for fountains, they paid for clean water, they paid for sewers, they paid for public festivals, they paid for poor relief. They gave their lives, they bled for their soil, they fought, and they maintained. And a lot of this is evoked unconsciously by the architecture that was chosen very specifically. In fact, the image of George Washington is very consciously associated with the image of of a ancient Roman general by the name of Cincinnatus. You may guess, being so close to Cincinnati, that is obviously an homage to this concept of Romanesque virtue. But it goes a step even further. Um, George Washington was part of the Cincinnatus Society, which was a society of military men who felt that their service to their country was part of this kind of Romanesque recapturing of that romantic value. Uh, the story goes that once there was a Roman general who was plowing his land, and Rome was under threat by invader. So the Senate came out and asked him to take up powers and become a dictator. And to symbolize that dictatorship, he was given an axe wrapped in reeds called fascia, these little bundles of sticks, and that gave him symbology of absolute authority over the Senate and the military. Then, when the threat was over, he retired. He went back to his farm and gave away that axe wrapped in sticks. He gave away that power. And in the same way, the same kind of iconography is given for George Washington. And although it shows him not in military dress on the left, he's dressed in civilian clothes, his left hand, is draped over a cannon wrapped in fascia. So here he's got the new version of the axe wrapped in those bands, those 13 bands that would be the 13 colonies, and it's got a cloth draped over it. And much like the image of Cincinnatus here on the right with his hand on the plow, behind George Washington, you can see behind his ankles, there's a plow waiting for him. So he's giving up all ultimate authority. So there is nationalism everywhere. And if you're not sure just how entrenched that nationalism is, go to Eden Park in Cincinnati and you will find the statue on the right. It is a direct homage not only to self-sacrifice but also to George Washington. It overlooks the river. And so also nationalism is taught in the schools from a very, very young age. Here is a school for children in the early 1920s pledging allegiance to the flag. And if you think they look kind of weird putting their arm out towards the flag, that's because things change in the 1930s. This putting your hand out towards the flag becomes seen as maybe not exactly the thing you should be doing when you're pledging allegiance. And we'll get into that in a later lecture, but I'm sure you can kind of guess why that fashion fell out. Now, nationalism inspires service to country. Nationalism becomes a way to inspire particularly young men in the 19th century to join up, more than just for social advancement. The military had been used prior to the 19th century as a vehicle for social advancement, particularly for officers. Now, it still is a vehicle for social advancement. There are many retired generals, many retired colonels, many retired officers who go on to become pundits and authors and security experts and appointed to cabinets, you name it. So it can be a vehicle for social advancement and political advancement, but it doesn't necessarily automatically equate that way. It also, nationalism inspires service to country to defend the national way of life, whatever that is, another amorphous concept of the way of life. What does that mean? And also, it's a way to make a living. After Napoleon, on European soil, there is increasingly large standing armies that are professional and relatively fairly paid. They have better equipment than maybe their predecessors did. They get a decent wage. They're able to support a family. It's a profession, for lack of a better term. Essentially, nationalism provides a reason for existence, or a raison d'etre, for a paid army and a navy. The nation must be defended. One of the ways that you can defend the nation is by serving in the army, by serving in the navy, by being a part of the power structure that keeps the nation safe. But the nation, and especially nationalism, can be turned to or corrupted rather, to a more nefarious end. The very existence of a large standing army basically justifies the use of that army. There's an old saying that when all you have is a hammer, every problem suddenly looks like a nail, and that's true with the military. And military service and the need to, quote, defend the nation can distract from domestic issues. And if you think it doesn't still happen today, it does. For example, when there was a protest about the kneeling during the national anthem, all of the rhetoric was about disrespecting soldiers. Well, was it really? Was Colin Kaepernick and others, were they disrespecting soldiers because the national anthem is all about soldiers? No, the national anthem is about the United States, not about soldiers per se, period. We pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, not we pledge allegiance to the Army, we pledge allegiance to the Navy, we pledge allegiance to the Marine Corps of the United States of America. It isn't that way. We pledge allegiance to the flag, and the flag represents all of us. If only the military could fly the flag, maybe they would have had an argument. If only the military could say the Pledge of Allegiance, maybe there would have been an argument there. But that the reason behind Colin Kaepernick's kneeling was about social issues and to draw attention to social issues. And it did indeed draw attention, perhaps both negative and positive, but then the rhetoric didn't become about the issue itself and whether the issue was justified or not. It became about whether it was this other unrelated thing. It's a distraction. It's a way to distract people from potentially a very fruitful and important discussion around social issues. Was Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the right social issues? Was there really the oppression that he was talking about? Was there really the need for reform the way he was talking about? None of that was actually said. It was all about a knee-jerk reaction. And there can be emotional components tied to that, especially when you first saw the image. Did you get immediately angry? Did you get, I don't want to talk about that. Oh, he's a traitor. Why? Why? I thought the whole point of being an American and the whole point of being free is you have the right to protest. You have the right to free speech. Isn't that what we're talking about? If we're not talking about that, then obviously the trick of distracting people worked. So it can be still used. Europeans, in their rivalry after the defeat of Napoleon, begin to extend their reach further and further into Africa and Asia. And it's largely, and we'll cover this in later lectures, it's largely to extract resources. The military and military service is used overseas throughout the 19th century as a way to quash local resistance, to ensure that resource extraction continues unabated for the enrichment of the home country. And if it's working class people who have to go to war in order to kill other working class people to ensure that that wealth is still extracted and concentrated in the hands back home, so be it. And so we get the emergence of things like the Boer War, which we will cover later on, not this time. And we're also going to talk about the atrocities of the Belgians in the Congo. But essentially, there are wars, colonial wars, that are waged in Africa, in Asia, and in other places in order to ensure the wealth extraction. Now, this does lead to a kind of trickle down economics in that the European standard of living does go up for upper middle class people, for well-to-do people. There is more general wealth. There is a higher GNP. That sort of thing feeds the factories. Factories put out more products that sold to more markets, and so on and so forth. But Europeans are trying to divide up this continent, particularly in Africa, and it leads to potential for conflict. It does, however, lead to an agreement in the late 19th century of how to divide up Africa to prevent war, because it seemed like border skirmishes might possibly flow over into actual on the ground fighting in Europe, and that needed to be avoided. The war against Napoleon was still relatively fresh in the memories of those in the late 19th century, and they wanted to avoid that. Maybe a little less fresh by the time we get to the 1890s, definitely old news by 1900, and by the time we get to the first decade of the 20th century, it had all been forgotten. But in the middle to the later part of the 19th century, Napoleonic Wars and its destruction and its carnage were still very much a reality. And so there's this rivalry, this kind of competition abroad, but it doesn't really spill over into European upon European war. Why? Well, part of it is an agreement. Part of it is you've got local populace you need to put down. And so by putting down that local populace, you're essentially elevating the working class people who maybe came from impoverished backgrounds back in Europe, and they're able to go overseas and show their physical and military superiority to local tribes and local peoples. And so there's that sense of superiority that begins to kind of creep into that nationalism. Not only are you defending the nation, you're proving that you're a better human being or a stronger human being or a more evolved human being than these people who live in Africa or Asia or the Pacific Islands or Australia or wherever. Now, locals didn't necessarily take this laying down. There were many, many mutinies and many, many uprisings, one of which I'm going to focus on right now, and that is the uprising that happens in the middle of the 19th century in India. Now, in India, there was a group of hired military mercenaries. They were basically corporate security, and they were referred to in general as the sepoys, Sepoy. The sepoys were a group of Hindu and Muslim soldiers who were working for the East India Company relatively indirectly. They were not directly working for the British government. Well, they rebelled against the company because of many, many missteps. The culmination of which was the ammunition that was used uh, was often coated in tallow. Tallow is animal fat, and where did the animal fat come from? Well, it was a mixture of beef and pig fat. Well, if you're a Hindu or a Muslim, that offends both of you, right? So there was this protest and wanted to use a different type of lubricant for the ammunition, which the East India Company refused, and so this led to an uprising, an armed uprising that potentially could have unseated British control in Europe. I'm sorry, in India, uh, and led to a consolidation of power for local warlords or local elites. This was referred to in Indian textbooks as the first Indian War of Independence. It's referred to in British textbooks as the Sepoy Mutiny, and you can see the difference in language there. There's a very nationalistic sense in the Indian book, and also a counter-nationalist or anti-nationalist sense in the British textbooks. Essentially, what happens is the British East India Company really bungled this and had to call for the British military to defend their vested economic interests, which the British military quite happily did. And the British government took direct control over India, and that lasted for nearly 100 years, this direct control, 90 years to be exact. And the British, in order to ensure that another mutiny or another uprising like this didn't happen again, imposed a lot of rules and a lot of laws to kind of keep the local population both subjugated and economically unable to mount another resistance. So you can see how nationalism kind of arose in India, this idea of a first war of independence. We're going to be independent from Great Britain and their colonial ambitions. So there's a very nationalist idea there. And there's also a very nationalist idea in that, well, India belongs to us, and that uprising wasn't an uprising, it wasn't a rebellion, it wasn't a war for independence, it was a mutiny. They illegally rebelled against us. Mutiny is often used for military to describe a military um, uh, direct action, if, for lack of a better term, like refusing to do certain things is considered mutinous. So you can see the nationalist narrative on both sides. Now, there's also a nationalist uprising in China, and it's largely brought out again by the British. Now, I pick on the British largely because they're probably the most familiar to us, but also because in the 19th century, the British were really the big naval and colonial power of Europe, followed closely by France and much less so by Spain, which had really lost a lot of its colonies in the 19th century. So it was kind of a remnant of what it used to be. So England is the biggest. It's got the biggest navy. It has an efficient army. They're very good at doing what they do, and they have, for lack of a better term, a very unfortunately cozy relationship with entrepreneurs and with capitalists, for lack of a better term. Capitalists being the people who own the banks, the people who own the major stock trading, the people who are invested in ensuring that wealth grows. So that's what I mean by capitalists. Well, the British merchants had long been frustrated by Chinese indifference towards finished products, and they hit upon a product that they could grow in a colony and sell in China that the Chinese couldn't resist, and that was opium. Opium was mixed with tobacco and sold illegally in Chinese markets. Now, it's important to note that at the time that these British merchants were growing poppies in India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, mixing it with tobacco that was harvested from the Western Hemisphere and from brought in from the United States. At the same time that they were selling it in China, it was illegal to sell in the British colonies. So you could produce it. That's perfectly fine. That's legal. You could export it. That's perfectly fine. That's legal. But the consumption or sale of opium within Britain was strictly illegal. But that didn't matter to British merchants, and it didn't matter to them that the Chinese had outlawed opium. In 1839, things come to a head as a new reformist nationalist Chinese government begins to crack down on the illegal opium trade, trying to stop the world's largest opium cartel. the world's most powerful opium cartel. The Chinese in 1839 seized about 1,200 metric tons of opium. For scale's sake, 1 metric ton is roughly 2,206 pounds. So for a grand total of 2.6 million pounds of opium were seized in 1 year. So when I talk about England being the largest drug dealing cartel in the 19th century, perhaps in all of history, I am not exaggerating. So 2.6 million pounds in 1 year was seized. The British merchants were quite upset about that, and they persuade Parliament to declare war on the Chinese for, quote, unpaid debts, unquote, because they wanted the Chinese government to pay for the opium that they seized. Much like if, the Sinaloa drug cartel wanted the United States to pay for all the drugs it seized, all the illegal drugs coming into the border where it's illegal to sell and you should not be expecting money for. That defeats the whole purpose of them being illegal, right? Well, the British merchants persuade Parliament to wage war over this illegally seized property and to get the money back. Well, the Chinese have a large army and they're like, bring it on. Unfortunately, although a large army, relatively unmechanized, relatively less technologically advanced as the British Army and Navy are very well coordinated. They wage a very successful war and they defeat the Chinese. The Chinese have to pay for the lost opium and must open more ports to trade with the English. Bad, right? So imagine the United States wages a war against the Sinaloa drug cartel and loses. And now we have to open up at least 5 different ports of entry for illegal drugs to flow in. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that after the end of the first Opium War, one of the demands was that England said China had to agree to the legal importation of opium. Opium is a very addictive drug. I don't know if you're aware of the opiate crisis. That's synthetic opiums. People become physically dependent upon opium. They absolutely positively must need it, much in the same way that people absolutely positively need water and food to drink. It changes the chemical structure of your brain to the point where if you suddenly give it up, if you're a long-time addict, if you try to quit cold turkey, you could go insane, you could have a stroke, you could have a heart attack. So it's not like it's an easy thing to give up. And even if you're not at that point, giving up heroin or giving up opium it leads to incredible physical pain, incredible, often referred to as excruciating, as in being nailed to the cross kind of pain of going through withdrawals. Well, 20 years later, not quite 20 years later, the Chinese government has regrouped, reformed, nationalist campaign to re-strengthen the army and reassert national dominance, and the Chinese are again at it, trying to make opium illegal. They begin to seize more opium shipments. They even jail some British opium dealers, and the British go to war again, and the Chinese lose again. And this leads to things like agreements that the English merchants will be immune to Chinese prosecution, immune to laws in China. On top of it, China must pay for the war to the tune of 8 million pounds of silver. Yes, 8 million pounds, as in the weight of silver. 8 million pounds in silver, and must make opium legal again, and must offer up Chinese workers or so-called coolies to work in the plantations and uh, um, colonies overseas for Britain. This leads to an influx of coolies, quote unquote coolies, in the United States in the 1850s and 1860s, who then go to work on the Transcontinental Railroad to pay off some of the indentured debts that they owed to the British government. So the United States is affected by this opium war as well. So essentially, standing armies are used as adjuncts for domestic police as well. So it's not just projecting power overseas. We've kind of talked about this a little bit when we touched on the Luddites, those working class skilled workers who destroyed machinery during the Industrial Revolution to try to reassert their economic and political dominance. The military was called in, and that Luddite movement was put down. It was also used to quell riots and demonstrations in Ireland, for example, if we're talking about England. And they were also used throughout Europe to punish agitators, people who were socialists, people who were anarchists, people who were communists. And there is some difference between socialists and communists, and I promise we'll get to that in a little bit. So essentially, the military, especially in Europe, less so in the United States, although there are some cases that we're going to touch on, there are used in Europe to put down out groups within the nationalist framework, those who are not really part of the quote unquote us group, those people who are causing trouble. And to make sure that we're not just picking on Anglophone societies, let's look at France. At the same time that France was up to the same kind of shenanigans that the British and the Belgians were in foreign territories, to the same shenanigans that the United States was in its own territory, so too did that nationalist, the kind of framing of nationalism as an us versus them kind of paradigm play out in France in the late 19th century. There was a French captain who happened to be Jewish descent. He was in the army. He had a stellar record. He was accused of spying for the Germans by a Christian rival with completely fabricated accusation, no evidence really, and it led to a very dramatic, blatantly anti-Semitic trial that led to Alfred Dreyfus's confinement for a good 20 years. He wasn't eventually acquitted. He wasn't acquitted until 1906. So he spent a little bit over, oh, I'm sorry, 10 years. He spent 10 years in prison. His name really wasn't cleared until the 1960s, although pardoning seems that it should be part and parcel of having their record expunged. No, pardoning just means that okay, you committed the crime, but we're going to give you clemency. And although he was acquitted of during a second trial, his reputation was forever destroyed. And this led to this kind of very anti-Semitic, let's root out the Jews kind of mentality within France. So comparatively, one of the reasons why Dreyfus was seen as possibly being a spy for Germany is comparatively, Germany was actually very accepting of Jews in the 1890s to the 19aughts and 1910s. Very accepting of Jews, invited Jews to come in, promoted them within the government. Very, very friendly. So in order to differentiate the French nationalist identity from the German nationalist identity, the French adopted a very anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish view or anti-Jewish rhetoric. So poor Alfred Dreyfus, it was a completely contrived case. He was accused of not being a true Frenchman, of him being having allegiance to this strange and mystical and alien religion, even though his family had lived in France for hundreds of years. He was French through and through, highly decorated, but it didn't matter. His reputation was besmirched and destroyed because of this unfounded accusation, because a Christian rival basically fomented this anti-Jewish identity. So here we've seen a few cases of that nationalism gone off the rails and kind of become toxic, if for lack of a better term. So nationalism and European balance of power really is a tricky tightrope to walk. On the one hand, Europe avoids any major wars for about a century. It's often referred to by historians as the long century. The 19th century is referred to as the long century because attitudes towards each other last well into the 20th century, a kind of a cultural century, if it were. Not, New players such as Italy and Germany kind of upset this balance of power, but they're more focused on consolidating their own identity and being team players, kind of mediators in this milieu. So they're not really upsetting it too much. So they're brought in as kind of they earn their way in as semi-equal partners. Italy is a lesser partner. Germany establishes itself as a much more major partner, maybe a much more major rival, particularly of Great Britain. But they're also eager to ensure that the peace maintains, because if a war breaks out, being right there in the center of Europe, they're most likely going to have to fight a two-front war if a war breaks out. And they were very keen to try to avoid a war, at least in the 19th century, of that character. So all in all, nationalism allows for a deeper unification of people, allows us to care for people that we've never met. It allows us to absorb new peoples, to welcome them in, to meld them into our society. Europe has a lot less experience of that happening in the 19th century than, say, the United States does, but it still happens. As the consolidation of different ideas, different dialects, different religions begins to kind of be accepted. And the assimilation of ideas and notions that are amorphous, hard to define. What is freedom? What is liberty? What is our way of life? What is our national goal? What is the ultimate aspiration of our country? What do we hope to be? These are very nebulous and ill-defined concepts, yet nonetheless we remain loyal to them. And that's a good thing for nationalist ideas to build, for lack of a better term, to build a more perfect union. Now, nationalism can also lead to treating others as non-human. If you think about some of the rhetoric surrounding, say, Muslims or people from Latin America or African Americans in the United States, there's a lot of dehumanization, that they're somehow murderers or that they're terrorists or that they're criminally inclined, that they're inherently more vicious or dangerous or scary. And so this also leads to nationalism can also lead to an unthinking and unquestioning patriotism, a knee-jerk response, for lack of a better term, and it can lead to the alienation of internal so-called enemies that allows you to dehumanize even people who have been here for a long time, as Alfred Dreyfus was. He and his family had been French citizens for hundreds of years, but somehow his loyalty, his valor, his honor was called into question because he was deemed to be part of an other group within the nation. So European workers did not take these changes and did not take this stuff laying down. There's not just the geopolitical changes, but also the economic and social changes that they're dealing with as well. So we've dealt with kind of a macro idea, this countries projecting their power abroad, using armies abroad, using armies against out groups within the country and out of the country. Now we're going to look a little bit more on the ground. We're going to come zoom down to street view, as it were, if we were Google Maps. And in order to do that, we're going to talk about three new terms. So this is the last three terms. This is part two of those terms. First is progressivism. It's a mid to late 19th century movement that is largely brought about by the middle class. And they're trying to address social ills that they see. If we think about the middle class as being the managers, the lawyers, the doctors, the engineers, the people who interact both with the affluent and with the working class, they're uniquely positioned. These middle class people are uniquely positioned to see the social ills that are affecting their societies. And they're uniquely positioned to have enough free time and enough empathy for lack of a better term, to do something about it. The elites are definitely more removed. They're more insulated by their wealth, and so they're not as receptive to change. Why should they change? The poor are increasingly powerless. They're increasingly exploited, so they don't have the wherewithal to cause change. The middle class does, and that's where progressivism comes in. Socialism is a 19th century movement that posits that individuals in a society are bound by a contract, a social contract, that we look out for each other. And one of the ways that we can look out for each other is to address social ills, to address economic disparity, to address internal issues through government action. The idea behind socialism is that the government is an expression or a tool of the people. And that if the vast majority of people say we need, for example, safety for water, that we want to make sure that the water we're drinking is not contaminated with radioactive material or poisons or bacteria or whatever, then the government is uniquely situated to make that happen and to provide a kind of social safeguard to ensure that contaminated water isn't made available to the public to drink. Communism is a step beyond socialism. Well, quite a few steps beyond socialism. Communism is a more politico-economic movement that is characterized by a collectivist owning of all means of production. What's the difference between a socialist and a communist? Well, socialism, you can have capitalism. You absolutely can. But it's given a lot of guardrails. So there's a lot of kind of strictures that are placed upon capitalism, at least in the 19th century. So socialism is okay with private ownership. Socialism is okay with large corporations. Socialism is okay with people starting their own businesses and that sort of thing. But it shouldn't be done to the exclusion of the responsibilities that they have for the society. If you're going to build a factory, you're responsible for taking away any of the waste and properly disposing of it, and not just dumping it in a river, for example. Communism, on the other hand, says nobody gets to own large businesses. Nobody gets to own it. It is all part of the society, whether it's an oil field, a power plant, a textile factory, or whatever. The people collectively, the nation collectively owns all means of production, whether it's food or goods, and then distributes equally to each other. So the idea is that everybody contributes to the best of their ability, and everybody receives the benefits of that production, so that wealth isn't concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And that is largely in response to the unmitigated laissez-faire of European economics. It is articulated best, although not solely, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in this Communist Manifesto. So they're not the ones who start communism, but they're the ones who articulate it the most succinctly and perhaps define it the best. So there are three reactions to the social problems that are happening in any given European country. You have the conservatist reaction, which is typically very elite. They're very suspicious of these radical ideas of things like democracy, republicanism, voting, that sort of thing. So they're very suspicious of radical ideas, and that the people really are not very well educated, so they really shouldn't be the ones who are choosing leadership. Just leave it to us, the wealthy landed elite, who know the direction the country needs to go. They also revert to a more predictable social order. Conservatism in the 19th century believes in a very top-down kind of social order, that there's a king or an emperor, for example, and that you have landed elite who have broad swaths of power, that there's a very quiet middle class, that sure, they can go in, they can do doctoring, their engineering, their whatever, but they shouldn't expect to have power within the society. And then, of course, the workers should just shut up and just go to work and be happy for what they have. And they do acknowledge the realities that there was an industrial revolution, and it has upended the traditional hierarchies of medieval and early modern life. That elites are not necessarily the same as the aristocracy from before, and there is an end of absolutism. So there isn't necessarily a all-powerful, like Napoleon-esque emperor who's going to rule. There will be checks and balances upon them, although those checks and balances will be held by very wealthy, very powerful, politically savvy people. That's it. Progressivism is kind of the middle ground. Progressivism is a middle class movement. It is driven by evangelical Christian duty, the sense of the sense that I get on reading all these progressivist journals and their writings was that they felt that they needed to protect the lower class. They needed to shield the lower class as best as possible and help improve their lives. They agitated for the expansion of social services, particularly those offered by the government in order to improve the lives. Particularly cleanliness was like they were almost fixated on this concept of cleanliness, of washing and soap and water and that sort of thing, but also on education as well. Educating people, teach them how to read and write and add and subtract and that sort of thing. And progressivists really called for a more responsive government. They were really into this idea that the government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. And they believed that it was imperative to reform the different governments lest there be a revolution. And these middle class activists, these middle class progressives saw the anger and the energy that is invested in some radicalist groups like communists and anarchists. Communists who wanted to tear down the economic structure, anarchists who wanted to tear down everything and just get rid of all forms of government. It was just rotted beyond repair and needed to be torn down. And they were afraid of that because that meant that they were jeopardized as the bourgeoisie, as the haves, as you were, versus the have-nots. And there were a lot of have-nots. And if they got really, really upset, it'd be a storming of the Bastille on a much, much larger scale. So they were very keen to try to reform the government to be a pressure release valve for all of that pent up anger and frustration. Then you have the radicalists, which are lower middle class and working class, sometimes well educated, often very rebelling against their own economic class if they were middle class, or if they were working class, they were very much radicalized, had been educated by well-meaning, perhaps middle class people. And they begin to call for continuous revolutions. Socialists call for revolutions, as do communists. Anarchists call for just burning the whole damn thing down. And they focus on addressing economic issues. These are very populist movements. The communist and socialist movement in the 19th century are very much rooted in popular opinion. And so we cannot say, oh, well, it's a bunch of academics who never really worked a day in their life. No, these were the people who worked in factories for incredibly long times, under incredibly dangerous conditions, it lived in inhumane, disgusting conditions, and they were forced to do so, and they couldn't lift themselves out of poverty. They couldn't. I mean, the circumstances around them were just so that it kept them mired in misery. And so they called for immediate action. They tried to unite workers. They tried to curtail the abuses of power by any means necessary and basically upend who gets to have a say in the political system. So, conservatism in the 19th century was very much about undoing the revolutions of the late 18th century and early 19th century. They end the French Republic and restore imperial rule. we see the return of quasi-absolutist monarchs. Um, those are really few and far between. We see that more in Russia and less so in other parts of Europe. We see the emergence of a constitutional monarchy instead. So there are monarchs, they do have broad range of powers, but they are checked by a written document and often by some kind of parliament that essentially curtails the level of power. So there isn't the absolutism of, say, Louis the 14th or Louis the 16th, but there isn't the wide-eyed, crazy democracy, the radical democracy of the first French Republic and the Committee for Safety. So they're very much about restoring the political structure. They're not so keen about reverting or trying to turn the clock back on the Industrial Revolution. They embrace laissez-faire capitalism. Why? Well, because laissez-faire capitalism ensures that those in power continue to keep earning lots and lots and lots of money and accruing lots and lots and lots of power. And they begin to question this concept of freedom. What level of freedom should their people have? Is there such a thing as too much freedom? And then, you know, if it comes down to it, if we're really talking about laissez-faire economics, we're also talking about we don't want to interfere in the course of events when it comes to poor people. That poor people are probably poor because they deserve it. They're born inferior, they're born stupid, they're born for criminal behavior, they're born spendthrifts, they're born drunkards, whatever. So it's probably a moral failing that they're poor. After all, there are examples of people who are poor, who are able to work their way up to become middle class, or middle class who are able to work up and become elite, or in rare cases, people who are born poor who become elite, who become like the barons of an industry through grit and determination. And if everybody just buckled down that way, they would all be better, but they're just too lazy or too stupid or whatever. So it's a moral failing. Now, there's a lot of plot holes in that mindset. If everybody was able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, which is a phrase which is ironic in that it was initially started as a communist German communist phrase that meant something that's impossible. So imagine grabbing your shoes and trying to pull yourself into the sky by lifting your shoes. It's not possible, right? That's what pulling yourself up by the bootstraps is. But I digress. So the poor people, if everybody was able to lift themselves up, then everybody would be rich, and wouldn't that be kind of like communism, right? Wouldn't it? Kind of? Everybody is equally rich. Everybody had the same path to success. There are no losers. Is that really a thing in laissez-faire capitalism? I don't think that's the way capitalism works. So the government, by and large, was very much hands-off economic and social issues, with the exception of debt. Now, debtors' prison had long been a mainstay of early modern borrowers. So if you were, let's say, in the 1700s, 1750, 1740, if you had borrowed way too much money, you might find yourself imprisoned until you could pay off the debt. I don't know how that could happen, but go figure. And you would then be released if your family was able to pay off your debt. Until then, you stayed in prison, right? But it becomes increasingly increasingly automated in the 19th century, especially as you get the government begins to start poorhouses, workhouses, and some governments, like the French government and the English government, they issue licenses for begging. You have to have enough money to buy a license to be able to go out and beg for money because you don't have enough money to buy food. And so, yeah, that kind of weird kind of logic. You need a license to be able to beg, right? And they turned a blind eye to vices, things like alcohol and prostitution, largely because the elite enjoyed quite the debauched party now and then. Absolutely true. It was kind of an open secret in the 19th century that most politicians, most people in parliament had both a wife and at least one mistress, that they went to church on Sunday but went to the saloon on Saturday, that sort of thing. So it was not a thing that the governments were interested in cracking down on. So this moral aspect of maybe some of the social ills, turn a blind eye to, except for debt. Debt had to be quashed. Debt had to be punished. Being poor charges interest, for lack of a better term. A good example of this is and we're going to pick on the English again, is the treatment of the Irish in the 19th century. Now, for most of the 19th century, Ireland is kept rural, unmechanized, and impoverished, largely because of the profusion of poor people who were in a perpetual state of living paycheck to paycheck, for lack of a better term. So they're cheap, poorly paid labor, no impetus to change over by the English or Anglophone landlords to more mechanized labor and labor saving. There's been slow relaxation of anti-Catholic laws, so there is a little bit of social mobility, but not very much, largely because the Anglophone and Protestant governments were not keen to see the Catholics acquiring any more power. In the 1840s, a blight begins in Europe. It's a fungal blight that begins in Europe and moves westward, starts in Germany, works its way through Belgium, and eventually finds its way to Ireland. This blight rots the potatoes while they're still growing in the ground. Now, as I mentioned before, potatoes have a phenomenal impact upon European society. They provide food and nutrition in otherwise untenable soil, stuff that would be very difficult to grow nutritious crops in, typically tight space. I mean, you could even take a 5-gallon bucket now, take a potato that is starting to sprout its eyes, bury that potato, and you'll have a potato plant in no time in a 5-gallon bucket. I mean, super easy to grow, right? Well, that blight unfortunately affected one particular type of potato called the lumper potato, which was the most popular potato in Ireland. And this was through no fault of the Irish. It was just the one that grew on the worst possible soil and provided the best of all potatoes. So why wouldn't you grow that? Why would you take time to grow other potatoes? Well, the English government initially responded with some kind of half-hearted relief efforts. They bought, for instance, corn from the United States to try to bring it into Ireland. But the thing with corn is, especially because if we're talking about the 19th century, you got to think not as ear of corn that you eat, on 4th of July, but more like the corn meal that you would use to make a corn tortilla or cornbread. That has to be treated with a chemical in order to make it digestible by human beings. Otherwise, when you ingest it, it creates a bunch of gas in your stomach that can be very painful. It leads to diarrhea and vomiting if you don't eat it, if you don't treat it properly. And so the government response was largely ineffectual. At the same time that these Irish people are starving, the plantation system, which is growing a lot of wheat, barley, oats, and other grain cereals, are happily exporting. For every 6 ships that leave Ireland with food, 1 ship is coming in with food to try to relieve them. Eventually, this ineffectual government response devolves into cruelty, partly because of a change in government that goes from a kind of a Whig, I'm sorry, a loyalist government to a Whig government. A Whig government is kind of like the prelude to the Republican Party in the United States. They have the same roots. They believed in laissez-faire economics, and they believed in the supremacy of the market forces, that the invisible hand of the market would dictate relief. Unfortunately, along with that invisible hand was a not so invisible hand of anti-Catholicism. In fact, one particular one particular functionary in the British government, a man named Charles Trevelyan. He was the Secretary of Treasury and put in charge of famine relief, stopped all shipment uh, of goods into Ireland, of not necessarily goods but food into Ireland, stopped work programs that were allowing people to purchase food, and said that the judgment of God sent the calamity, that is the blight, to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated, that essentially it was God's will that these people starved to death. Meanwhile, food is being grown and exported quite profitably. About To give you an example of the level of indifference and the kind of interference in those so-called invisible forces, Queen Victoria donated £1,000, 1,000 British pounds, to the relief of famine in the 1840s. Selim III, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, tried to donate £10,000. His gift was reduced to £1,000 so that he wouldn't outshine Queen Victoria, because it would be improper for a foreign potentate to give more than the Empress of England and Ireland to famine relief. All told, about 25% of the Irish population die of starvation or disease. Another 25% emigrate abroad, and it wasn't until the early 21st century that Ireland returned to the same population levels as it had in the 1840s. So this is a profound impact upon Ireland. It's also interesting to note that this blight does come back in the 1870s, but that the backlash of the horrors that happened during the Irish potato famine, particularly the military, the unrest that it caused, the international condemnation that it caused in the 1870s. The English government was quite keen to make sure that there was a very robust response to the blight when it came back in the 1870s. So although some people were affected, some people actually did get ill, some people actually did starve to death. It was not nearly the numbers that you saw in the 1840s. So the reaction to laissez-faire by both reformers and radicals was to be disgusted by this conservative laissez-faire reaction. Reformers were appalled by the indifference and discrimination, and the loss of life to them was staggering. For these very devout Christians, it was unconscionable that the government wouldn't react the way that they did. They acknowledged that their private charities that they had donated to had been overwhelmed, partly due to political restrictions, which I talked about just a little bit ago, but also because the infrastructure for private relief of large-scale tragedy is just not there. There cannot be a private run charity that is efficient enough and broad scope enough to be able to address all the needs of such a large calamity. For radicals such as communists and socialists, they were more vocal in denouncing the cruelty and indifference of laissez-faire capitalism. For socialists, they wanted guardrails on it. They wanted more stringent guardrails. Communists wanted to do away with it altogether. And they highlight the need for the masses to have power, that it is these policies by the elites that adversely affect the poor the most and benefit the poor the least. And that the power structure prevented relief of the Irish and other similar incidents throughout Europe. Power ignores the suffering of the masses, and that power benefits from the genocide that's inflicted by these kind of policies. That it didn't hurt the people in power. They stayed rich. They didn't have to worry about starving to death. They didn't have to worry about catching cholera or dysentery or typhus because they were malnourished. They didn't have to worry about that. So it doesn't affect them. It might as well be happening on a different planet. So progressivists really spearhead a movement to try to change the political attitudes towards the poor, towards the working class. And it was largely led by women who are very well educated middle class women. They weren't tied down by marriage. Most of these reformers, particularly who create so-called settlement houses, in other words, they were kind of like community centers of their day. They weren't married, so they weren't tied down to a husband. They were inspired by Jesus' ministry to the poor, because if you go through the Bible, I don't think I found one particular passage where Jesus went into the house of a rich man and kind of kicked back and had a cigar and a whiskey and said, "Hey, you know, you're doing really great. God will bless you." Most of his ministry was to the disenfranchised, the poor, the sick, the children, the leper, the prostitute, the thief, you name it. He spoke to them. And when it came to the rich, when the rich wanted his help, he was like, "You are helping yourself. You don't need it." And so they begin to tackle the issues of the day. They look at what are the root causes of poverty and how can these be addressed. Well, one of the ways that they can be addressed was through education. By making children better educated, they have more opportunities in the future. If they can read and write, they can instead of maybe working in a factory, maybe they can become secretaries, or maybe they can become clerks, or maybe they can become apprentices to better paying jobs. They also tackle the widespread filth that is accumulating in cities. Now, we've not really talked about that, but we did have a little bit of an exercise last week, a muck and brass, where we talked about the accumulation of human waste because of the concentration of people in poor neighborhoods, the accumulation of soot and dirt because of coal burning plants. Every house had to have something that was going to keep them warm in the winter. Often that was either wood or coal fired. That created ash, and that creates really bad conditions for the environment. So you would have a lot of dust, a lot of dirt, a lot of uck and muck and disgustingness. Getting people to wash more regularly reduced the number of people who were infected by colds and flus, uh, who were infected by dysentery, by typhus, so they wouldn't be as ill, they wouldn't be susceptible to die, and they wouldn't be as susceptible to spread that disease. The progressives also railed against what they referred to as moral turpitude. In other words, moral lacking. Remember, these are very evangelical Christians, so things like drinking, promiscuous sex, sex out of marriage, that sort of thing. These were really, really frowned upon. And they didn't look too close as to the core reasons as to why people drank to excess or why people engaged in prostitution. To them, it was a moral failing. Oh, you're just loose in morals. You should never really do that. And they never really digged deeper and saw that a lot of these prostitutes had to go turn to prostitution because their husbands were out of work or their husbands had left them or they were starving and it was the only way to make money, that sort of thing. Well, when I was talking about the dirt and filth that was present, one of the things that really pushed this progressivist movement was the cholera outbreaks of the mid 19th century. Cholera is a side effect of the close confines and lack of necessary infrastructure in working class neighborhoods. It was not unusual in the Victorian times in the 1850s for middle class people to have flushing toilets. Not so much in working class neighborhoods. In fact, it was not unusual all the way to the 1930s and 1940s to have non-flushing toilets in working class neighborhoods. In fact, it wasn't until the 1950s with the destruction of the majority of Cincinnati's West End to make way for the I-75 highway that outhouses were commonplace in those neighborhoods. So these cramped confines, these dirty conditions, the lack of sanitary conditions, the piling up of garbage, the presence of vermin, the presence of human excrement and urine really led to the spread of disease, things like cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and measles. Between 1817 and 1860, in England alone, over 15 million people die from cholera. This is a very serious disease, and it was caused by and large by poor living conditions. So exposure to the disease combined with malnutrition leads to horrible pandemics. And even if cholera and diphtheria and tuberculosis weren't present, malnutrition itself leads to other physical ailments, things like rickets, which is brittle bones or misshapen bones, scurvy, which is due to the lack of vitamin C, citrus in certain vegetables. Having fresh vegetables and fresh fruit are important to staving off scurvy. So these middle class women begin to live in these poor areas, these so-called settlement houses. They settle in houses in these areas. That's where the name comes from. And that forces the government to extend services to them. And if you're going to extend services to these middle class people, well, by like kind of like accident, you extend these services to the poor people. Things like sewage and water treatment, trash disposal, coverage by the fire department, police patrols, and you begin to see this progress towards social redress of grievances. Things like the repeal of poverty laws. You get the abolition of debtors' prison. Right now, in the 21st century, there are no direct debtors' prisons. There are some ways that certain municipalities are getting around that, but there is no law on the books saying if you're in debt, you go to jail, kind of thing. Progressivists also lead the charge on crime and moral ills. They begin to tackle organized crime, prostitution, gambling, alcohol, human trafficking, that sort of thing, with varying success. Progressives, however, have a blind spot, and they agree by and large that poverty is caused by laziness or a lack of character. They buy into this elite narrative, partly because some of their progenitors were able to work their way up to middle class, partly because of this kind of like emulation of the elite, and partly because of some very judgmental evangelical ideas. And so they were okay with the existence of orphanages and workhouses. And progressives helped to criminalize prostitution and particularly alcohol. We see that with the temperance movement in the United States. What happens in the 1920s, that prohibition, that is a extension of that progressivist movement in the United States. And so there's a disparity of effects that the progressivist movement has upon the poorest of the poor. Some people who were maybe not as poor off, or maybe they were working class but just lived in really bad neighborhoods, they saw and absolutely saw a lifting of their standard of living. But the poorest of the poor, the people who were most exploited, the most abused, didn't really see that good of an improvement. To make matters worse, progressives really turned a blind eye to high-end vices. They really focused on poor people's vices. So the prostitute who was standing on the street corner versus the prostitute who ran a bordello at which, their husbands may go to on occasion when he's out with quote the boys, and they turn a blind eye to some of these inconsistencies. They're more focused on the moral turpitude of the poor people and less on the moral turpitude of the rich people. A good example of this, and one of the real critiques of progressivist attitudes, comes from in the form of Charles Dickens, himself a progressivist, but who saw that the progressivist movement was really kind of a little too stuffy and inflexible in their viewpoints. And he writes in Oliver Twist, the parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved that Oliver should be farmed, or, in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female who received the culprits at and for a very low wage per head. So he's very acerbic and very sarcastic in his, it was magnanimous of them to send him to basically a juvenile detention facility run by somebody who gets paid very little, and whose occupants are not really being reformed. They're merely being warehoused. They're not getting a lot of food. They're not getting a lot of clothing. And so they roll around on the dirt in the dirty floor, and they are not very well maintained. So, how is this addressing the social ill of poor Oliver Twist, an orphan in working class Victorian London? The middle class was paternalistic and patronizing in the eyes of the radicals, and that the progressivists really didn't address the systemic roots of the ills. They were addressing symptoms. Okay, so the poor live in bad living conditions. Let's fix the living conditions. Well, it didn't answer why do they have poor living conditions. It wasn't like they elected it. Who owns those buildings? Who owns the ramshackle buildings? Who prevented the fire department from covering those neighborhoods? Who said that they don't get to have access to clean water? They're not addressing the ills. And so they're taking a kind of a band-aid approach, for lack of a better term. To the radicals, the root cause of misery was the unfettered uh, acquisition of property, of profits over everything else. For every dollar taken by an extremely rich robber baron, from an extremely rich entrepreneur, from an extremely rich industrialist, from an extremely rich capitalist, that was a dollar or more less to feed the poor, to address the suffering of millions. How can one person acquire millions when millions can't acquire anything? And this leads to some very vibrant and in some cases violent workers' movements. Workers have been staging strikes and walkouts and demonstrations illegally throughout most of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The landowners and the factory owners and the capitalists call in strike breakers, which are basically armed mercenaries. A good legacy of those strike breakers is the Pinkerton Security Agency, and to a lesser degree, the Brinks Security Agency. Or they would hire scabs, other workers who were equally impoverished, who were looking for any job. So remember how last week I was talking about Poles being worried about Irish taking away their jobs, and the Irish worried about blacks taking away their jobs, or Italians taking away their jobs. That's where those scabs come from. Maybe the industrialists would go and hire people from other neighborhoods or other sides of town to come work in their neighborhood, and thus breaking the strike, making it an ineffectual strike. The workers are fuming because throughout the 19th century, it was not unusual if you worked in a factory to work 12 to 16-hour days. And there were no safeties, there were no guarantees that if you got ill or if you got injured, wouldn't uh, that something would take care of you. If you lost a hand, that was your tough business. Sucks to be you. Go out and beg. Now, how can you get a job as let's say, a coal miner if you only have one hand? It's very hard. Or if you've lost an eye, how can you be a good weaver? Or if you've somehow been disfigured by being caught on fire or had your arm ripped off. Conservatives make these disingenuous arguments. The conservative capital holders make these disingenuous arguments saying that acquiescing to workers' demands is basically giving in to terrorism. There's these arguments that limiting the hours worked every day was limiting the freedom of employment for workers, that if they wanted to work 16 hours a day, why shouldn't they be allowed to work 16 hours a day? Why shouldn't they be allowed to maximize their earning potentials? And any laws intended to limit the amount of hours that somebody can work is basically flying in the freedom of these poor working class to lift themselves out of poverty. If that was true, if these working class were able to lift themselves out of poverty by working 16-hour days, then most of these working class people would be lifted out of poverty by working 16-hour days, but they're not. So where is the meat in the argument? It is a facile or empty argument. Socialists and communists begin to use similar language. They talk about workers' collective ability to exert pressure. They talk about strength in numbers and that they need to stand fast. So socialists begin to enlist the aid of news media and progressives, and they begin to force concessions with it throughout Europe. For example, in England in 1830s, labor laws were passed that limited the hours for women and children to 10 hours a day, so that the argument goes, of course, that children would be able to then learn and become better, be able to go to school for those hours. I mean, I don't know how much school they would be able to get in for maybe, what, 4 hours maybe a day, and that women could be able to go home and take care of their families. You wouldn't have this disintegration of the social fabric. In Germany, there were pension laws passed in the 1850s, very staunchly conservative German government led by Otto von Bismarck, which initiated a one of the key socialist conceits, which was unemployment insurance, and a scheme was devised where both employers and employees would pay into a government ministered unemployment insurance and a pension insurance. So essentially, it was a all-in-one kind of thing, where you're in your pension if you know if you made it through the 30, 40 years of working. If you retired, that money was waiting for you at the end. If you got injured in between then, well, that money, whatever was in there, would go towards you at least not starving to death. We also have the passing of the antitrust laws in the 1880s, which were intended to limit the power of monopolies and their influence on the national government. Worked to middling to no success, but it was still there. So a lot of these socialists were very much about being um, very keen to evoke images of nationalism, to use that nationalist argument of, yes, we're the workers, we're loyal to this, we're loyal to the nation, we want what is right to us, we want the freedom of speech that is guaranteed in the Constitution, where we want the right to assemble, which is guaranteed by certain laws, or that sort of thing. And these are the demands that we want. We want to exert our power because we are loyal to the state. Now, communists and socialists often undercut each other, however. To socialists, communists are way too radical. There's no way that we're going to agree to the abolition of all private property. That's just crazy. Why shouldn't people be allowed to have some success? Yes, they have to pay a little bit more in taxes because they're that successful, but they can afford it. They have broad shoulders. They can afford it. The communists saw the socialists as excusing bourgeoisie exploitation, that as long as there's anybody who holds any property more than anybody else, that there's going to be exploitation. It's going to be an inherently unfair system. So rifts allow for violent factions to begin to emerge as needs are not met through strikes and protests and walkouts, as governments will acquiesce in one area but not in other areas, as they seem to be, as the forces arrayed against workers seem to be more and more consolidated to keep the working class down. There it begins to emerge a very much terrorist faction. Some of these terrorists refer to themselves as anarchists, who believe that all government institutions must be torn down, and this can be used both for movements and against movements. This violence can. Anarchists saw the use of violence as obviously one of the tools in their toolkit to ensure the toppling of the government or the toppling of the economic order. But also, some conservatives saw the use of violence as a necessary way to turn public opinion against these socialist movements. Good example would be the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, where a bunch of socialists were staging a protest at, demanding an 8-hour workday and safety regulations in a variety of industries. Now, there were police that were arrayed against and had been assembled against these protesters, and tensions were high. Suddenly, a bomb goes off in a trash can near the police, and several police officers are injured. This leads to a police crackdown on socialists, and it leads to rounding up of socialists, communists, and anarchists and suspected violent offenders within Chicago, and really turns the public opinion against this social movement in the 1880s. Historians, however, have really pieced together that this was kind of a reverse psychology thing, that it was actually somebody who was on the side of anti-labor who planted the bomb in order to sacrifice a few police officers in order to spark outrage. And it's not just a conspiracy theory. There's really compelling evidence that that's exactly what happened. That this was a case of it's better to bomb the good guys than the bad guys, because the bad guys would get sympathy if you bomb them, but the good guys, if they get bombed, they become martyrs to the anti-communist, anti-socialist cause. So we have three flawed approaches to some of the problems that are happening in the 19th century. You have the conservatives who are using strong arm tactics, which make the situation worse. They're using uh, very short-sighted use of violence to quell dissent, and they eventually do bow to pressure, particularly of the reformist progressives. The progressives are very much evangelicals. They do, however, have some serious blind spots. Although they are keen to talk about Jesus' ministry to the poor, they are also quick to judge others. They also do not turn the other cheek. They are very judgmental. They often don't try to understand some of the root causes. They just think they know what's best when they come in. This increases exposure of the classes to each other, which is kind of a good thing, but it also leads to a paternalistic attitude by the progressive reformers, like shush, shush, shush. We know exactly what you need. Just listen to us. We'll do it. They do shape the modern city. Progressivists, if they had not been as active, you would not enjoy the extension of sewer lines, clean water, safety in building houses, having certain building codes, um, redress of wrongs within a civil situation, public transportation, all sorts of public services. Those would not exist without progressives. Radicalists also had some really flawed approaches. They call for revolution, which pressures the middle and upper classes, which gets some progress, but also causes some pushback. For example, an 8-hour workday is considered a standard workday. A 5-day work week is considered a standard work week. 40 hours is considered a standard work hour period for a week. That all is because of radicalists who are pushing and pushing and pushing. But also there is some pushback against them. There is right now the very real hangover of maybe mistrusting radicals, of mistrusting socialism, particularly as socialism changes in character and changes in usage throughout the 20th century. And they also ignore more nuanced economic factors. This kind of very wide-eyed, good on paper idea of communism being if everybody owns all the production, everybody's needs will be met. completely ignores the idea of, well, somebody's going to be in charge and somebody might abuse the system, and there might be people who are more equal than others. It also leads to a lot of issues with production and the dissemination of materials. A really good example of that is the way the Soviet Union had bread lines and toilet paper lines and shoe lines and any kind of good. It was very difficult to get, and you had to jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops. But they do ultimately shape the modern safety network. Things like Social Security, Medicare, the Section 8 housing, all of these would have been impossible without some radicalist ideas and radicalist agitation. So some issues are ignored by movements. All of these movements ignore this idea of racial disparity. All of these movements, with the exception of communism, ignore the idea of anti-Semitism or anti-religious uh, um, discrimination. Communists would like to do away with religion completely, so whatever. They also they also ignore sexual identity and the idea of fluidity of sexual preferences, whether it's bisexual, homosexual, transgender, whatever. But they all do influence the 20th century and the reactions, especially after World War One. There comes a re-examination of these different movements of communism, socialism, and of laissez-faire capitalism, really, after World War One. And also keep in mind that revolutions aren't just a one and done thing. They gains can be made, absolutely, like the 40-hour work week is now standard. It was radical back in the 1900s, but or the early 1900s, but eventually it became something that was possible. Not only possible, but expected. And maybe in the future there'll be shorter work weeks and you'll have more free time. But as many gains as are created by things like that, they can also be undone. Think of the gig economy. How many people have to work 2 or 3 jobs and really don't have a lot of access to benefits that had been hard fought and won by radicalist union socialists, for example. So revolutions aren't one and done. They can be repealed, they can be rolled back. And so vigilance and engagement are incredibly necessary to ensure that the society goes in a direction that, as a collective, we want it. So essentially, we have this tension between a bunch of different forces in the 19th century. Some are good, some are bad, some are ugly, some are pretty inspiring. There is a lot of unrest, there's a lot of power struggles, and there's a lot of violence that happens even though there's no real continental war in Europe. And there's rivalries that are quickly coming to a head within Europe. Sooner or later, something has to give. And between the social disorder and the need for expanding markets and the need for expanding territory and that friction that comes when rivals rub up against each other, whether in Europe or abroad, something is going to change. That's it, guys. That's the long and short of it, or actually more the long and long of it. That will cover us for week 9. I hope you come back in for week 10.